Hi, I'm Wes, the Explosion, and the Mega Man Game Boy games, Rockman World in Japan, had a bit of a tumultuous start. Capcom farmed most of the work out to other companies, going with one for the first, then another for the second, and then going back to the first, Minakuchi Engineering, for the third. And it kinda makes sense. While a little odd, Dr. Wily's Revenge wasn't a bad little game, whereas 2 felt really off. If you want to go with what works, bringing the initial team back sounds like a good call. But did it pan out? Did Minakuchi manage to make another decent one, or should Capcom have continued shopping around? As you may or may not expect, the plot is pretty bare bones for this one. According to the English manual, Dr. Wily has hijacked an oil platform and wants to use it to tap into Earth's core and harness its magma to power his machines. According to the complete works, the supercomputer in charge of managing society starts going haywire, messing up people's day-to-day lives, and an army of robots starts making trouble. Dr. Light assumes it's Dr. Wily again and sends Mega Man out to stop him. And that's pretty much it. It feels like they really didn't care about this one, since not only is it extremely basic, but it's not even consistent between sources, almost like so little importance was given to the story that they didn't even bother translating it and just let the English team make something up. Or maybe Capcom America thought that the oil platform hook was more marketable or something, but regardless, it probably doesn't matter much, and at least it doesn't mess with the space-time continuum and make me want to forget that it ever happened. Since this game is a mashup of NES's 3 and 4, you keep your slide, but the charge shot gets added in. This is a pretty big deal since a lot of the regular stage enemies can be felled with a full charge, and you can fire through rows of obstacles like the tadpole eggs and garbage blocks, though a partial shot doesn't really seem to do a lot, so holding onto it for just that extra second or so makes a huge difference. Eddie has also been added back in, you finding him about halfway through a good chunk of the stages and him tossing you a random power-up before disappearing. Whether you love him or hate him comes down to whether he gives you the right thing or not, like normal. You get Rush Coil and Rush Jet, both of which must be earned. You get Coil from Snake Man in the first half, and it works like it usually does. Summon Rush and jump on his back to be bounced upwards, costing some weapon energy as you do. Jet you get from Dust Man in the second half, and it sucks! Summon Rush and ride him forward, energy ticking down as you do so. You can jump off at any point and fire regular shots from your buster. The thing is though, you can't move Rush up and down. He flies straight. He'll appear at the altitude you press the button, so you can hop into the air to make him appear higher. But you have to be really sure you're at the right height, otherwise you could end up crashing into an enemy, spikes, or a wall. I'd question whether this was a hardware limitation if the last game didn't let you fly freely. Guess they felt that they needed to nerf him and really overcorrected. As for your weapons, they're mostly recycled and function pretty much the same. Search snakes travel over surfaces while Gemini lasers bounce off them. Shadow blades can be thrown out in different directions and boomerang back, and Spark Shot just kinda fires straight ahead, but it is good against one of the new bosses. You also get Dust Crusher, which goes straight, then breaks apart, Dive Missiles, which home in on enemies, Skull Shield, which protects you, you can run around with, and it can take a few hits, so it's pretty good, and Drill Bombs, which explode and can take out certain walls. The only new weapon is the Screw Crusher, which comes out at an angle, then falls back down. It's got good ammo consumption and can be pretty spammy, plus the angle is good for hitting some enemies in odd locations. Of course, Shadow Blade already covers some of that with its diagonals, and you get Screw Crusher so late game that, while not a bad weapon, its use is extremely limited. Honestly, not a bad idea to save it specifically for the final boss. In fact, this is one of the few games where I just kind of hold on to most of my weapons and don't look for places to abuse them. Though Shadow Blade and Skull Shield definitely have a lot of utility, so I do bother with them in some sections. There are 10 stages. The first 4 are for Spark, Gemini, Shadow, and Snake Man, and borrow pretty heavily from their NES counterparts. Some bits are adjusted to account for gameplay changes, or I'm guessing the limitations of the Game Boy, like there's no water section in Gemini Man's due to the lack of Rush Marine, and you can also shoot through multiple eggs with a charge shot, and rather than tubes that spawn cloud platforms, you just kinda hop around outside in Snake Man's. Shadow Man now has bomb platforms, and the projector enemies are low enough that you can just shoot them. Each of these aren't too bad to get through, but holy crap, Sparkman's stage is a nightmare. I'll talk about a lot of this when we get to difficulty, but this stage has a ton of spikes and pits, a lot of slowdown, and spots where you have to creep your big, fat hitbox just to the other side of a falling block to avoid getting knocked to your death. I don't know, maybe it's a me thing, but this one just seems to take a lot more than the other three. Then you get a mid-stage, where there's just a few disappearing blocks and a boss, hardly a level. After that, you get Dive, Skull, Drill, and Dustman. Again, borrowing a lot from the NES, though the water physics don't feel quite right in Dive Man's stage. I swear, my jumps just feel off, and I also feel floatier than normal, though that could be the cramped space giving you so little wiggle room that even hitting the wrong direction just a little bit can be a death sentence. Skullman's has some really irritating enemy placement, but otherwise is just platforming over bones. Dustman has a lot of shielders, mets, and enemies that pop out of pits, plus the weird, whatever these enemies are, take a lot more damage than I remember. This is probably also the stage that demands the most perfect jumps. Drillman still has the falling rocks, so it's not a good idea to go here before beating Skullman. Also a lot of weird platforms, like the splitting ones from Shadowman, the shifting spikes from 5, and a few disappearing blocks. And I'll also state here that a lot of the levels feel really long. I'm not sure whether it's because I'm so used to the NES games, with levels I can zip through compared to here, where I die quite a few times, meaning I'd wind up spending more time in them, but there were quite a few instances where I'd end up swearing when I found out I hadn't even hit a checkpoint. The last stage absolutely is longer though, starting with a boss fight, then a good chunk of level, then another boss, then more level, and then the final boss, though no boss rush here. Guess they wanted a full 8 stages with a proper select screen, which works for me. Anyway, this stage throws a lot at you, stuff from previous levels with a lot of places to die. At one point, they give you tubes that pop out the clapping plug enemy, then swap to one that drops boulders, and you're just kinda supposed to know that they changed. As you can probably tell from my tone, while I love each of the original stages on the NES, I am not much of a fan here. Matching up with the stages, the bosses are Spark, Gemini, Shadow, and Snake Man for the first part of the game, and Dive, Skull, Drill, and Dustman for the second. And while the bosses fight pretty much the same, Mega Man does not, at least with the first half. Having the charge shot against the 3s makes it so that you can go up against any of them at any point, at least if you go for full charge. Partial won't help too much. It was pretty interesting facing these guys again with an option I normally wouldn't have. Besides that, the Robot Masters have the same moves, just in a small space, giving you less room to dodge and making them harder, at least when you're not maximizing your buster and weapon use. And of course, a few weaknesses get changed up, due to not having the full roster from either NES game. A few special notes: I cannot manage to jump around Snake Man like I can on the NES, Shadow Man is a lot more manageable, due to him seeming less aggressive with the slide, you having the upgraded buster, and no longer having to use the Touch Me weapon to beat him. Dustman can waste a lot of time with his Suck-Suck, which I guess is business as usual. And Drillman is no longer invincible when he starts to dive, making the fight go a lot faster. There's also a trio of original bosses. The first is the Giant Susie, which you fight midway through the game and again in the final stage. It moves around trying to crash into you and does a ton of damage. Given the incredibly tight space you have to face it in, it's kind of a pain and I don't much care for it. The Mega Man killer, Punk. He crashes down, folds himself into a spiky ball, and flies at the other side of the screen before jumping up and down, tossing screw crushers at you. He can be kinda challenging. It's easy enough to slide under him when he dashes, but you need to jump over him if he goes along the floor, and the smaller screen means that you don't have a lot of time to determine which action you need. His screw crushers also block buster shots, and it can be tricky getting down the timing for when you want to fire to nail him without accidentally hitting his attack instead, though there's a pretty reliable window as he goes in and out of his ball. The boss fight would be a lot more tolerable with more room, but it's not the worst. And hey, Punk at least looks pretty darn cool. Then finally there's Wily with his weird face alien mech. Stage 1 is really easy, as soon as you learn the pattern. It rises, plops down on the other side of the screen, then fires 2 missiles. Pretty simple to just run right under it, stay out of range of the missiles, then fire a charge shot into its face, so I'd call it a gimme. The second form is mostly annoying. You need to huck attacks at the cockpit, preferably screw crushers, while it just sits in place and fires balls at you. It's really not hard to dodge attacks, but the balls also block all your shots, so the timing can be tricky. If you get hit, it'll likely be because you got impatient and got nailed, rushing an attack, which probably also got knocked away. Congratulations! I like how goofy this guy looks, but as for fighting him, I'd rather not. So yeah, having the charge shot makes some of the bosses interesting, and Shadow and Drill are a bit easier to deal with, but the new ones mostly annoy me, each for very different reasons. I still like Punk at least, and am glad they brought him back for 10's DLC. For visuals, it's once again NES Mega Man, but on a much smaller screen. Everything translates pretty well honestly, and none of the sprites feel off like they did in World 2. The stages look nice, Skullman's bones coming back and upturned ribs even being the choice for that level's spikes, and while the rest all mostly match their NES counterparts, I do find myself appreciating some of the background details, like the swaying trees in Snake Man stage. It's really impressive how much they got out of the hardware. For choice of palette, you have Game Boy greens, Pockets grays, and the different colors of the Game Boy Color. I think I said this last time, but I kinda like the grays, probably due to my first handheld being a Game Boy Pocket, but if you can, color is definitely the way to go. Some things look a little off, like Mega Man being default orange, or is that more peach, is weird, but learning to read the different colors makes the game a lot easier. Playing it in black and white, there were some points where I found myself grumbling, not being able to tell what was background and foreground, but here, different layers have different colors, clearing up the confusion. They can also make some attacks and baddies stand out, some enemies even having weak points in different colors to highlight them. I'm not sure how the programming works here, and I doubt any of it was intentional, but the different hues communicate a ton of information to the player. They also make the game look really sharp, even if some of the colors are mismatched. The music is largely borrowed from 3 and 4, but I am impressed by how close they sound to the originals. In Dr. Wily's Revenge, the tracks were a little remixed, maybe to give them a bit of a unique identity, maybe to help cover up the hardware limitations, but these sound almost as good as they did previously. I guess they really learned a lot between games, and it's obvious with some, like Dustman, but if you aren't listening closely, I could see some confusing the soundtracks for a lot of levels. As for the original stuff, it ain't bad. The title theme isn't super memorable, but it does have some pep. Punk's theme is pretty cool, definitely makes him seem nefarious, like he's up to something. Wily's Fortress sounds really determined, ironic since I feel pretty beaten down by that point, and the ending theme I can take or leave. The unused theme of Mega Man I probably would have preferred. So yeah, really great job adapting the borrowed music and not horrible with the new stuff, even if I don't feel like blaring it from my car with the windows down. Oh, and for sound effects stuff, most of it sounds pretty good, except for the noise it makes when you charge your buster. That one can be a little annoying. This game is hard. It has the same issue the other Game Boy titles do, the smaller screen making everything feel cramped, you having less room to move around in, and less warning for some attacks. Here though, there's a lot of times where it feels weaponized against you, as opposed to being just a hardware limitation. There are a lot of instances where running ahead will see you colliding with a shielder. You need to stand your ground a bit more with some enemies since the smaller screen makes it easier for them to respawn. Having less of the level on screen makes the trash compactors really hard to blast through, and some jumps have enemies on the other side that you can't see until mid-leap. There's also a few sections that feel a little cramped. And heck, some of the worms pop out practically on top of you in Skullman's stage, making it feel like you're more meant to memorize enemy locations rather than react to them. On top of that, this game has some of the most liberal use of spikes and pits I've seen, with a lot of pixel-perfect jumps and the cramped screen giving you very little wiggle room with some of the enemies and insta-deaths. There's even this one screen that I'm not sure how you're supposed to get through. You might be able to use Rush Coil just right, placing him in the spikes and then bouncing off, but I always tank a hit, run to the other side, then use Coil to reach the ladder. One thing's for sure though, the solution sure ain't Jet since you get it from this stage. Speaking of, I get why 3's version of Jet isn't used here, since it was pretty broken, but not even being able to tilt up or down while riding Rush just feels really bad. Unless you can see the other platform you want to reach, know the level inside and out, or have a gun against your head, using Jet is a risky prospect, especially since it can get caught on things and drop you pretty easily. Then there are the longer stages, assuming it's not just all in my head, with a lot of lost progress when you fail, the last stage especially being very drawn out. There's also a lot of slowdown that can screw up your timing and inputs, though that's always a problem. There are some good and interesting challenges here, don't get me wrong. I think the bit with the low spiked ceiling and the Hammer Joe is neat, even if it is mean, but on the whole, this game feels like it was meant to be frustrating. I'd like to think that Mega Man has a reputation for being hard but fair, but this one feels malicious. I think I've said this before, so this isn't the only exception. There's a lot of sections that would work on a bigger screen, like the shielders and enemies waiting on the other side of pits, so I would say there's a possibility that hardware's to blame, but that they went out of their way to make even Rush Jet difficult to use, and the demand for perfection, where most of your deaths are going to come from insta-kills rather than your life bar running out, kinda makes me think that they did this on purpose. I'm not sure if they were angry that they missed out on World 2 and decided to take it out on the player, or they knew that the difficulty was part of the appeal of the series and feeling like they had something to prove, confused hard and cheap. Of my 2 recent runs, I used save states for the last stage the first time and used the rewind once on my second, but only because I chose the wrong stage and didn't want to waste my 5 lives getting through it again. So it is doable, but I don't think that it feels good to complete. I don't know how controversial a stance this is, but Mega Man 3 for Game Boy is the only one in the World side series that I don't like. I'd go so far as to say that I hate it. Even 2, I at least get a little enjoyment out of, just from a fascination at how shoddily it was made, but this one, I feel miserable playing it. There's a part of me that wanted to do another playthrough of this, since I think I should have messed around with the weapons more, but about halfway through my second run, I was close to rage quitting, so that option was out. Because of this lack of playtime, there's a lot of parts here that I'm second guessing myself on, wondering if I'm fixating too much, giving this one crap for things I give the main line a pass on, or if there are obvious solutions that I'm just missing, but end of the day, this is a Mega Man game that I don't want to play anymore, and I think that that's the most telling. While not nearly as bad, I'm reminded of X6, undeniably a Mega Man game, but just feeling so awful to play with them getting some of the aspects of it so wrong that it feels like a perversion of something I love, which makes me hate it more than I would in a vacuum. If you feel the need to play this one, make sure you do it with a method that will allow for rewinds or save states, preferably both, but otherwise, skip this one. Don't play it unless you're a diehard. To go back to the original question though, I am glad that Capcom went back to Minakuchi Engineering, but that's more due to the merits of 4 and 5 rather than 3. Had this been the last in the series, I might have considered the side games a mistake, even if I do kind of enjoy the previous 2. I'm done whining though, so now I'll ask you, do you like this one? Hate this one? Is it horribly unfair, or do you like getting beaten into the concrete and I just need to improve? Thanks as always for watching, and maybe consider subscribing if you're into platformers, especially Mega Man. For everlasting peace.